Finally, the ban list is here, and today not only are we going to talk about what I expect to be the front runners of the upcoming meta, but we're going to also talk about the other potential decks you could play, as well as some of the future stuff that might influence the game as well. But first, as always, before we dive into all that, go grab yourself a cup of coffee or something, that way you guys can sit down and tune in. Let's do this. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to split the decks into different categories. Of course, there's going to be the top meta contenders. These are going to be the decks that I expect most people to gravitate to at the beginning of the format. Then, of course, there's going to be the potential contenders that could rival these decks that, depending how the format plays out and how the tech cards evolve, could definitely make their way into the format to be one of the best decks. And then after that, we're going to be talking about the sleeper decks of the format. This is going to be the decks that either a lot of people have forgotten about, or at least have a good shot at catching people off guard because they're going to be focused on the top echelon of the format. So to start painting a picture of what I expect the meta to be for the top contending decks that I expect a lot of people to gravitate to, the first and probably most obvious deck of the bunch is going to be the branded Despia deck. With the new ban list, this deck only loses Expulsion, and at the latter end of this format, you've seen a lot of players already cutting that card from the main. Heck, you've even seen players cut the card completely from their 55, so I think this just goes to show that going forward, this really isn't going to affect the deck at all. In addition, if you still wanted to take that route, we have the new Sanctifier Dragon, so the Puppet Lock is still very obtainable for the deck. But now, with Super Heavy Samurai not being a crazy combo deck, and of course a Rise Heart Pass being the scariest thing to really deal with when it comes to Kashtira, some of this deck's biggest threats have been watered down so much, and it really just clears the way for this deck to thrive. Branded does have the downside where there are a lot of counterplays to it, be it Ash or D-Barrier or anything of that nature, but I'm pretty sure all of you would agree that this deck is a horrifying deck to go up against. But nevertheless, I really expect this deck to take the meta by storm, and whether or not it's the best deck of the format, time will tell, but I definitely think it's going to be one of the scariest things you're going to have to go up against. Now, another deck that I expect to do very well this format, and even in the future, of course, is going to be Sprite. This little level 2 deck is one of my favorites, and I'm so excited that it's still in the meta. The deck hasn't had Elf in a while, so the grind game is pretty weak, but I feel like if you're playing the Melfi variant of the deck, you have a great shot at no matter what tournament you're going into. And again, we'll find out as time passes, but my gut instinct tells me that this is no longer going to be a hand trap format, so being able to play board breakers and power spells is one of the things that this deck does so great. And again, just like I mentioned, so many of the scariest decks of last format really got hurt, so this deck is just going to have that much of an easier time breaking and playing through boards. Another one of the top meta contenders that I think a lot of people were sleeping on last format is the Labyrinth deck. This deck is so good whether you're playing the traps in the floodgates, or of course the new furniture IKEA deck. I really love that variant. Really, I already felt like this was going to be a sleeper deck of that format, but now that we have all the powerful things in this format really shaved away, this deck really has so much more room to thrive. One thing to note though is the fact that, like I mentioned, I really feel like it's going to be a board breaker format. Don't be surprised if you see cards like Evenly Matched, Lightning Storm, all those cards coming back into main or side decks. And of course, this deck also loses to those kind of board wipe-esque cards as well. So even if you don't plan on playing this deck yourself or think it's a viable option, definitely make sure you respect it, because I really feel like a lot of people are going to be gravitating towards this deck going forward. Now, for the last deck that I expect to be very popular right out the gate is unfortunately the Kashtira deck. The main deck monsters on their own are very powerful into so many different boards, so even with one Arise Heart, this deck can break boards and build boards very easily. But that being said, it's a lot easier to side deck against this deck now. Before, you were worried, are they going to go Arise Pass? Are they going to lock all your zones? There were so many different things that could happen, and it was very hard to prepare for what they were going to do. But now with Diablosis gone, and of course the zone lock being gone, I really feel like this deck is going to be a lot easier to counterplay, but still something very viable in the current meta. Now, moving on to some of the potential contenders that I feel like are either going to be one of the top meta decks eventually, or as the format develops, these decks can really make their way in and shine at any of these locals, regionals, or YCSs going forward. For the first deck that I almost put in the top meta contender would be the Pearly deck. I really love this deck, and I think the deck is perfectly fine with one Delicious. Yes, it's really unfortunate. Getting access to Plump is going to be very difficult. No longer can you, my friend, reveal 3 Delicious. You're going to have to get lucky and hit one, or just open it, of course. I've also seen some players talk about playing a blind second deck revolving around searching your pieces with your happiness and of course setting up Zeus plays, which is definitely something that's viable for this deck. But don't forget, your extra deck is a rank 2 deck, and there are some amazing level 2s in the game. So whether you're playing a Nimble Angler package as discard fodder to set up rank 2s with your Beaver, or even putting a full-blown Sprite engine into the deck, which I definitely think is a great option, do not sleep on Pearly. While Noir doesn't sound like something that's going to be easy to obtain, I definitely think this is one of the Swiss Army knife decks of the format, and I was this close to putting in the top meta contenders. But again, as the format plays out, we'll see if it moves its way up. Now, another deck that went untouched and had some success last format was the Gold Pride Punk deck. This deck is an amazing combo deck, a bunch of one-card starters, and you have a lot of room for non-engine, which is always a great thing for, well, any of these modern formats. More players gravitated to the super heavy Samurai deck because it just felt like the higher ceiling or the better deck of that format. But now that that deck really isn't the best option anymore, the Punk Gold Pride deck looks to be like one of the best combo decks going forward. Like I said, one-card starters, lots of room for non-engine, crazy end boards with diversified interruptions that don't just auto-lose to something like Dark Ruler. This deck is so versatile in what it can do, and I definitely think you guys have to keep an eye out on it because this deck could easily make its way into one of the best decks of the format. It's really that good. Now for the next deck that really went untouched on the ban list is the Runics. This was one of the scariest decks last format pre-Syac, but of course with super heavy Samurai, this deck really had no room for non-engine to help stop that deck from winning. But now that this looks like it's going to be a board breaker type format, the Runic engine really can get splashed into so many different things, and I definitely think this is gonna be a viable option going forward. Konami was really smart in hitting the Nuchuri engine. I'm actually very glad they did it, so it's really gonna have to pivot in a different direction. So going forward, I'm curious to see how people approach it, but at the end of the day, this spell-based engine looks so powerful going into next format. I'm very curious to see how it plays out, but again, don't be surprised if you run into it at your top tables. Now, speaking of spell-based decks, with Engage and Multi-Role moving off the limited section, I actually think Sky Striker is a very good deck going into next format for a multitude of reasons. Sky Striker always has and will be one of the most underwhelming looking decks, but on paper, it's one of the most toolbox and powerful decks in the game right now. Since the release of the Ishizu Tier Limit deck, this deck really had no room to shine, especially with the introduction of Bestials as well. We really haven't been able to see this deck shine with its new support in the form of Linkage and, of course, Hamp as well. Again, Sky Striker is a relatively fair deck, but it rewards the technical player, so don't be surprised if you see players making their way to top cut or even winning events with a deck like this. But either way, time will tell, so we'll see where this deck ends up. But moving on to some of the more honorable mentions and some of the decks that I really think have a great shot in this format, let's talk about our first deck, the Rika Sun Avalons. This deck just never goes away. There's never a reason to hit it on the ban list because really it's not the craziest or the best deck of the format really ever, but this deck is so good and so many players don't understand how a lot of the cards work, and it really gives those players that are piloting it that much of an edge when going into these bigger tournaments. You already see this deck having so much success at bigger events, and it's for a good reason. The deck is super solid, makes some crazy first turn boards, and being able to tribute your opponent's cards for free, it's one of the greatest mechanics a deck could have. But that being said, there are a bunch of other decks that have my eye going into this format, one of which is the Sword Soul deck. Now that Denlong is off the ban list and we have access to stuff like Ringo Worm, this deck has so many different combos it can now branch off into, and I think it makes it horrifying to have to play against. This deck has always been one of my favorite decks. It's such a good mid-range deck, has a little bit of combo, has a little bit of grind game, could break boards very easily, and of course a lot of room for non-engine as well. I definitely think with the right pilot and the right build, this deck has so much potential in this format, so don't be surprised if you see it popping up, and maybe it's something you should consider yourself. Now, there's another deck that's shown up here and there last format, and it actually kind of surprised me, but now with this ban list, I don't see a reason why Dragon Link can't be a great deck coming into next format. The deck has really evolved into more of a bestial control, and I definitely see that aspect being applied going forward in this format. The fact that Diablosis is gone makes it to where now your Striker Dragon's a lot safer. Plus, this deck already has a great toolbox to draw from, so it really has a great matchup in so many different aspects. And I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the decks that I've been talking about actually do get affected by Bestials, so I'm curious to see if those do make way back into the main deck or not. But regardless, this is one of those decks that can really abuse those cards. So definitely pick this deck up if you haven't, because it's not only fun to play, but it's relatively budget as well. Now I have two more decks in this category I wanted to talk about, one kind of being more of a hope and the other being something I actually think could be good. The first deck I wanted to talk about I think is a great budget option and something that could really compete in so many matchups. It's the Trap Tricks deck. Already pre-Syac, you saw a lot of success at the regional level and occasionally topping YCSs. This deck has a lot of tools to play with and has a lot of great matchups, and while there are some board breakers that could definitely hurt this deck, I think it's one of the best options to fall back on when you really don't know what the meta is going to shape up to be, especially because Super Heavy's gone, so that really killed a lot of decks. I'm glad to see it gone. Now, for the last deck in this category, maybe I'm crazy or maybe it will make no showing at all, but I really feel like Tearlament is still a strong deck. Last format, Kashtira was way too strong for the deck and very hindering with a Rise Heart, and of course the Super Heavies really just negated anything that deck was trying to do. But now with those decks being hindered and a lot of the other decks being weakened as well, I really think this deck has a shot at being able to thrive in this format. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of counterplay. Of course, there's like the Bestials, there's a bunch of hand traps that work against this deck, and the engine is a lot weaker, but nobody respects this deck anymore, and I think that's what makes it so scary. I personally don't have my hopes up, but I definitely think at the right time in the right event, you could definitely catch a lot of people off guard. But with all that being said, the last thing I wanted to talk about is some of the new cards coming out to not only introduce a new deck, but influence some of the decks that are currently being played now. Now, in case you haven't already guessed, the new deck that I'm talking about that's going to come into the format is Vanquished Soul. When these cards dropped in the OCG, I was really surprised to see how well it was performing. In time, you did see it fade out because just some of the other decks were a lot more powerful. But now moving into the TCG, I definitely think the deck is in a very interesting spot. The deck is obviously going to have a lot of tools to combat the meta, but also with how hindered the current decks of this format are, this deck being at full power definitely can make a splash in this format. The playstyle of this deck is of course very unique, being able to tag your monsters out, and of course having column-based effects is very cool. It's definitely not a combo deck, it really thrives in the grind game, but like I stated, with how the format's shaping out, it definitely looks like this format could have long games. Whether or not it's going to be the best deck or a deck that just dominates the format, I doubt it, but we will see. But definitely keep an eye on this deck. It's something you have to respect. And if you want to pick it up, unfortunately, you know, everything was printed as an ultra rare, which kind of feels like it was on purpose. Now, for the last card I wanted to talk about, this isn't going to make a new deck, but it's definitely going to add layers to the existing decks, and that, of course, is going to be Assault Synchron. We're going to get this card right before the North American Nationals, so it's going to be very exciting to see how it affects the meta. Obviously, being a level 2 extender for the Sprite deck is really good. We're not going to be playing like the Chaos Ruler build that you've seen in the OCG, but definitely getting access to a free Baron de Fleur while searching extenders or anything like that is going to be very great for the Sprite deck. So whether you decide to play it in Sprite or Punk Pride or Bestials or you name it, I definitely think this card's going to have an influence on the meta. But whether or not it's going to warp the meta, I guess time will tell, but definitely keep your eye on this card because there's going to be some decks that are going to abuse it. So like I mentioned, this format looks like it's going to be really diverse and a lot of fun to play, and just keep all these decks in mind because as the format grows and as the meta shifts, a lot of doors will open for any of these decks to make their way into top cuts. With the new format, I'm going to be making a bunch of deck profiles going forward, so make sure you comment down below if there's something you have a question about or something you want to see me build. And of course, if you want to help the channel grow, make sure you subscribe, and also go click the link down below to Next Level Anime. They're the guys who make the gear I wear now and what I wear at events. So if you guys want to get some great anime gear, go check them out. Their prices are so affordable. Plus, if you use my code Cards&CoffeeTCG, you'll also save 10% at checkout, not only helping you save money, but a portion goes back to me, helping me make content for you. But once again, thanks for tuning in. I really hope to see you guys on the next one. Peace.